All right, today we continue our critical review of Jordan Peterson's We Who Wrestle with God, Perceptions of the Divine. Now, so far we've considered Peterson's treatment of the creation account in Chapter 1, Adam and Eve and the fall in Chapter 2, Cain and Abel in Chapter 3, and Noah and the flood in Chapter 4. So let's talk about Chapter 5. That chapter Peterson titles The Tower of Babel, God versus Tyranny and Pride. Now, in this chapter, Peterson's going to treat of the story of the Tower of Babel that's found in Genesis chapter 11, 1 through 9. So to recap that story, in case you're not familiar with it, this story takes place sometime after the Great Flood of Noah, and instead of spreading out to fill the land, the people gather together in a land called Shinar with a unified purpose, which is described in verse 4, where they say, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves." God then intervenes by confusing their language, which scatters them abroad, and as a result, the city name came to be called Babel, which literally means something like confusion or to mix up. And then later, Babylon, which is a city that will come to symbolize humanity's tendency to usurp the authority and sovereignty of God, as we see in the book of Revelation. So what's going on in this passage? Why is it that God has to thwart the building of the tower and the city and scatter the people? Well, I think Peterson is basically on target here. He sees this as a thematic depiction of a unified humanity using its intelligence and ingenuity and technological prowess in opposition to God's express command to Adam and Eve in Genesis 1. And this command gets reiterated to Noah and his family in Genesis 9 after the flood. And that command is to multiply and fill the earth. It's a command that actually gets repeated 4 times in Genesis to this point. So the tower is a monument of human autonomy, pride, rebellion, idolatry. And God's act to intervene here is actually both an act of judgment and an act of mercy. Okay, so Peterson thinks that what we actually have in this story of the Tower of Babel is, wait for it, an archetype, right? What he sees here is the archetype or the universal pattern within the deep collective psyche of the prideful and idolatrous spirit or process or force that eternally seeks to supplant the divine. So what Peterson identifies in this passage of Genesis is the archetype of the usurping spirit of Lucifer and Cain. Now on page 191, he summarizes the theme of this passage. He says that, quote, "The pursuit of technology engaged by these builders, the builders of the Tower of Babel, constitutes both a substitute for proper ethical striving and a form of worship of the intellect. They are the engineers, builders, and inhabitants of the eternal Babylon, the city of the prideful and presumptuous," end quote. So that's the theme for Peterson. So the builders of the Tower of Babel are, he tells us, Cain's spiritual descendants who embody the Luciferian spirit of pride. So what we have here, again, for Peterson is a thematized portrayal of the spirit or process of the psyche or society that aims downward and that sets itself against the upward aiming divine spirit. It's the spirit that is exemplified by arrogance, pride, presumption, and misguided ambition. It's the spirit that transgresses the proper human place, that supplants the divine order and spiritual hierarchy. It's the spirit of intellectual, technological self-aggrandizement, the spirit of idolatry and of false worship of human achievement and technology. It's basically the spirit that desires to be God or to be like God. All right, before seeing how Peterson develops this idea further in this chapter, let's talk about the perception of the divine that he abstracts from this story. Peterson's going to characterize God here in this chapter as the spirit or process or force which is in opposition to the spirit that builds the Tower of Babel. which is why the subtitle of this chapter is God versus Tyranny and Pride. So he tells us on page 217, God, in the story of the Tower of Babel, is the transcendent being who is the absolute antithesis of presumptuous authority. God is what must be placed properly atop both the psychological and the social hierarchy. So God is the spirit or force or process that when put in the highest place in the psyche and in society, foils the Luciferian spirit that builds the Tower of Babel. So God's the spirit that forestalls what Peterson considers to be the catastrophic psychological and societal disintegration that eternally results whenever towers of Babel are constructed. Now, if you've been following along in this series, Peterson's tendency to characterize God in functional and psychological terms should be quite familiar to you. It is, in my estimation, the central and unifying thread in this entire work. And since I've emphasized this several times in previous episodes, I'm not going to dwell on it here. Much of this chapter is dedicated to an exploration of the chaos and catastrophe that results when we, as individuals and as a society, are led by the spirit that builds the Tower of Babel. And for Peterson, there's a kind of logic that governs the inevitable movement from the Tower of Babel to psychological and societal disintegration. It's a logic that is eternally crystallized by the oft-repeated biblical warning, pride goes before the fall. It's the spirit that builds the Tower of Babel. That spirit, Peterson says, is a usurping spirit. It takes the place of God. It undermines the divinely established order and unity that is reality, or what Peterson refers to as the logos. So the divine order and unity is, for Peterson, that which is transcendent, that which is eternal. He says it's that which is axiomatic. It contains and reflects the fundamental defining presuppositions about the nature of reality. And this divine order is reflected in the hierarchy of values. It grounds the reality of basic moral truths. It provides for the definition of good and evil. It's the source of the principles of psychological and societal integrity. And it's the what he calls the necessary precondition for harmonious being. These are all ways that Peterson characterizes the divine upward aiming spirit or process. So, by definition, as Peterson likes to say, to reject the divine spirit is to reject any possible transcendent order and unity. It is to embrace a kind of disorder. It's to embrace chaos. And this just follows, again, by definition, in Peterson's mind. So, in this chapter, Peterson masterfully, I think, surveys the inevitable disintegration of both the psyche and of society that results from the rejection of the transcendent eternal divine order. He's going to show us the catastrophic fallout that results when we, in our pride and in our presumption, remove the divine spirit from the highest place. All right, so what are those consequences? Well, first, there is the denigration and distortion of masculinity and of femininity. Peterson thinks that the prideful, presumptuous overreach and usurpation on display in the Tower of Babel is clearly a masculine defect. But he also thinks that this degeneration of the masculine leads to a corresponding degeneration of the feminine, a degeneration that he sees symbolized in the Whore of Babylon, which is a symbol that he imports from the New Testament book of Revelation. The Whore of Babylon is an archetype of the downward-aiming feminine spirit that gets expressed in sexual seductiveness, in manipulation, in hedonistic self-gratification. Peterson has a lot of great things to say here in regard to the relationship between what he calls the technocratic spirit of Babel and a sexually debauched and pornographic society. And he proves himself in this section to be a staunch defender of monogamy and of marriage as a kind of a covenantal union, an institution. And he clearly appreciates the central importance of faithful, committed marriages and families for the individual and for the well-being of the individual and the well-being of society at large. All right. So the next consequence of the usurpation of the divine is the crisis of meaning and communication, a crisis that Peterson finds symbolized in God's act of confusing the languages in the Tower of Babel story. Peterson rightly tells us that in order to communicate, we must broadly share a kind of common understanding of reality, what he calls a universal point of reference. And without a shared understanding or perception of the real to anchor meaning, without preconditions for understanding, communication becomes impossible. He writes on page 220, if the technological enterprise aims itself at something deviating too far from the necessary psychological and social ideal, the central uniting axis, even the possibility of communication vanishes, he says. Then we become confounded in our language. And as an example of this, Peterson points to the current bewilderment over the notion of sex and the meaning of the words man and woman in our society. You know, terms that up until 5 minutes ago have been universally understood without confusion. So Peterson thinks that the mass confusion over the meaning of male and female today is a direct result of our prideful and presumptuous rejection of the basic categories of reality. Today, we've, in a sense, usurped the divine order and the divine prerogative, and we have claimed the right to a kind of autonomous self-identity or self-definition. What Peterson says is the insistence on the primacy of subjective self-definition. He says this on page 222. So we are today, in essence, and I think Peterson is right on the spot here, we are in essence seeking to remake ourselves today in our own image. That's what's happening. And I think Peterson is right there. And we're destroying the divine, in the process of doing this, we're destroying the divine fabric of the real. And it's no wonder then that basic communication amongst ourselves is just breaking down. I think Peterson's spot on here. All right, another consequence of following the spirit that builds the Tower of Babel, the spirit that usurps divine order and authority, is the inevitable descent into nihilism. And again, there's a logic here. Once the eternal, transcendent, axiomatic, divine order and unity is displaced, then there's no longer a basis for universal, objective meaning, value, and duty. There's no longer, again, what Peterson calls a reference point from which to define good and evil, right and wrong. And all we're left with is the empty husk of moral and ethical relativism. And Peterson is absolutely derisive of any form of existential secular optimism. He thinks you cannot secure meaning, value, and purpose in life in midair, as it were. In the absence of a unifying and purposive divine order, there is only complete and total nihilism. Peterson asks us, he says, what is life without hope but hell? And that is the end result, he says, of moral relativism, not some neutral rationality. So for Peterson, it's black and white, right? It's either you have a worldview, you have a perception of reality that allows for objective meaning, value, and purpose in life, or you have to swallow the bitter pill of nihilism. Okay, finally, Peterson warns us that the spirit that builds the Tower of Babel and usurps the divine order ultimately leads to a totalitarian and tyrannical takeover of society. He says that the technical industrial enterprise, when driven by false pride, is likely to, quote, ally itself with the spirit of domination, conquest, and power. He says that on page 203. So what is likely to result is what he calls a dystopian, Luciferian, Babylonian nightmare. And he points to modern-day China as an example of this on display. So Peterson tells us that it's the Luciferian spirit that worships technology, power, and control that has produced the worst monsters of the 20th century, names that we're all familiar with: Stalin, Hitler, Mao. All right, again, these are all consequences for Peterson, logical consequences of following the spirit or process or force that leads to the construction of so many towers of Babel. Chaos can be the only possible result. Again, for Peterson, that's by definition of removing the divine spirit from the highest place and putting ourselves there instead. All right, so that's the summary. Here's my brief critical analysis of this part of the book. All right, this chapter, it seems to me, exemplifies the wonderful gift to Western society that is Jordan Peterson. Peterson is at his best when his formidable intellect is trained upon the demasking of the fraud that is the promise of our secular, humanist, hedonist society. And this, I think, is the true value of Jordan Peterson with respect to Christianity in particular. Christians can fully embrace Peterson's insightful criticisms of our godless culture, which has enslaved the West. I think Peterson is one of those rare public intellectuals who can clearly see the devastating consequences of our embrace as a society of a materialist, naturalist, relativist perception of reality. And as I said, he has little patience for any kind of existentially optimistic form of atheism. In a way, this harkens back to Nietzsche and the French existentialists. Peterson fully appreciates the nihilistic entailments of atheism. And I appreciate Peterson for his clear articulation there. In a sense, Peterson is like a prophet of our times. He has a Jeremiah-like courage to publicly declare the looming existential catastrophe that is currently brooding in our culture and society. And he's willing to confront, again, in a public way, the power brokers within our society with their sin. He's willing to confront them with their sin. So he's also reminiscent of the biblical prophets as he calls us individually and as a community to return to the divine order and unity. But it's precisely here, in his perception of the divine, in his understanding of the divine order and unity, where he begins to falter, I think. So Peterson's calling us back to a perception of the world or of reality that he thinks staves off the catastrophic specter of nihilism. He wants us to embrace a perspective on reality that he thinks brings with it the necessary preconditions for universal and objective moral values, meaning, and purpose. But the question, to my mind, that is looming over the entire project in We Who Wrestle with God is whether the perceptions of the divine that Peterson delivers to us are sufficient for that task. That's the problem, I think, at the end of the day with this book. So although I think that Peterson has masterfully exposed the nihilistic emptiness of our secular humanist, hedonist perception of reality, he hasn't yet, again to my mind, offered a clearly articulated alternative that can do the work of staving off nihilism, of defining the good and the true, of grounding universal values, meaning, and purpose. So now what I see as Peterson's failure to articulate a positive account of the real sufficient ground for universal truth and goodness, I think it's directly related to his refusal to engage in metaphysics or in philosophical theology. Peterson simply cannot provide an alternative to nihilism without engaging in metaphysics. Peterson needs to provide us with a reasoned account of how his understanding of the nature of the divine, of the nature of God, can do the heavy metaphysical lifting that's necessary to ground universal truth and universal goodness. The functionalized, psychologized perceptions of the divine that he gives us in this book, I think, simply don't cut the mustard. They are insufficient. They cannot bear the existential load. So although Peterson forcefully insists that there is an eternal, universal, objective source of value, meaning, and purpose, his ontology remains obscure. Is there, for Peterson, something about the nature of reality itself and about God himself, if they're even distinct in Peterson's mind, that ontologically grounds the definition of the true and the beautiful, good and evil, and that makes a way for meaning and purpose, for objective meaning and purpose? Or is the perception of the divine that Peterson is offering, is it merely the shared structure of consciousness that is necessary for our survival, a kind of necessary fiction that we must tell ourselves and abide by for our own psychological and societal well-being? So it seems to me that this chapter displays Peterson at his best, but it also indirectly underscores and accentuates the gaping explanatory gap in Peterson's overall project. It is far from evident that a functionalized and psychologized understanding of the divine can do the work that Peterson needs it to do. And I think that is my primary criticism so far. Although I love this chapter, probably my favorite chapter so far, I think, like I said, it also really underscores what is missing in this book. So I'll stop there. Andrew, I'll turn it over to you. Any thoughts on that or on chapter 5 in general?
Yeah, so I don't have much to add to that summary. I thought that was a fantastic summary. Sorry, my mouse stopped working on me really quick. So anyway, yeah, so I thought that was a fantastic summary of it. The main thing that I kind of really wanted to draw a connection to is there's an author by the name of Jacques Ellul. It's, Jacques, Jacquelull, Jacques Ellul. And he wrote a book called The Technological Society, which is a fantastic book. And when I was reading through chapter 5, I couldn't help but think about what Ellul was saying in there all over the place. No, so Ellul actually, this is particularly interesting because Ellul is a French jurist and a legal scholar who also is kind of like a philosopher and sometimes a theologian. And he's a Protestant who converted to Protestantism while also having been a Marxist underground revolutionary during the World War II. And he's got an interesting background. But the idea of the technological society links in with his other reading of, interestingly enough, the founding of the city by Cain. And of course, then he links that to the Tower of Babel as well. This is in his book, The Meaning of the City. And then if you start unpacking his book, The Technological Society, you see a lot of overlap here, predominantly in the claim that technology, or rather technique as he defines it, is going to replace everything. It's going to consume everything. And so inevitably it will replace God. It will seek to replace God. But it's not that it will abolish God so much as it will claim his place. And that's the point that he makes that, I think, around like the 120s. And as soon as I read that in Ellul, my mind jumps to this other book that I'm sure a lot of people have heard of, which is Yuval Noah Harari's Homo Deus, right? Literally translates to, the God man here, right? And so we're talking about technology in that book, literally making us as gods, so long as the gods aren't free. But the idea is in essence, like in the very beginning, he even says that technology might even, like in the 21st century, will make a serious attempt to conquer death via technology. That we will be deathless by the end of the 21st century. I mean, these are kind of like unbelievably over the top aspirations, but you can see in that a kind of desperate attempt through technology to replace the divine, right? What is salvation in the Christian message, if not a message about death, right? And the fact is that this is an alternative salvation wherein we become deathless, not by the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, but by the innovation of technology. And so Peterson's text here, I think, was fecund on a number of levels, but that one in particular, I thought it really synced well with this current discussion of technology.
Yeah, and that's definitely a focus of the chapter. I didn't really focus on the aspect of technology in my summary, so I appreciate you bringing that to the fore. Any thoughts on, like I said, I think chapter 5 is Peterson at his strongest, but also simultaneously exposes his weakness to us in his refusal to get metaphysical, if you will. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and a lot of them actually will sort of sync up with my own chapter, wherein he deals directly with Jesus's sacrifice.
Right.
It's only a few lines in chapter 6, but he deals directly with it. And sort of a meta theme, we've seen this at least since I think chapter 3, that the idea of like sacrifice essentially brings a certain reward in proportion to the sacrifice. And so Jesus's sacrifice is ultimately going to be, archetypal in relation to our own sacrifices, which is really, so far as I can tell, related to we just raise better children, in essence, right? Like we just raise better families. And so the salvation is in a proper functioning society based upon proper functioning families. And, that's a great thing. We definitely need that. I mean, I will never condemn that as a strong and righteous cause to champion.
Right.
But the fact is, that's just not salvation in the biblical corpus. So that's
right.
And it would be, to be perfectly blunt, it would be a little disappointing to me if that's what salvation ended up being. I don't think, because the fact is, living in a world where you might be striving, but the whole world around you is not striving in this way, even if it brings you meaning in whatever capacity he's highlighting, would still ultimately make you an outsider at this point, right? Like imagine the people living in Sodom and Gomorrah. Imagine the people living in Babel, right? Imagine if you then picked up Jordan Peterson's book, miraculously you had a copy of it, and you started implementing that in your life while living in Babel. He says this in chapter 6 and in my chapter next, but, there could be a sense in which, there's still hope. You can strive for this greater good. But in terms of the richness of life, in terms of actually having any sort of satisfaction, or even, to be perfectly blunt, fulfillment, I have a hard time seeing that as actually enough. I think you'd probably you'd grow up and live out your life in an ostracized state, which by definition would be an utterly horrible way to live.
Yeah. And I just don't think he gives us enough to truly avoid nihilism at the end of the day, because what you need some kind of like I said, just to repeat myself, you need an ontological foundation. I mean, if Jordan Peterson's saying that this is the way to thrive, this is the way to individuation, well-being, psychological harmony and wholeness, okay, fine. What he's giving us then is kind of a prudentialism, right? Yeah. Like, if you want to thrive, if you want to be an integrated whole person, then do this, right? But that alone isn't enough to stave off nihilism, because at the end of the day, it's just another form of relativism and subjectivism, right?
Well, and I've been wondering this whole time. I know he's not going to, but what would he do with a book like Ecclesiastes, right? Where the repeated phrase over and over and over again is meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless, a chasing after the wind, right? And the idea of the meaninglessness, this vapor, is really kind of like an evanescence, which is a pretty common ancient literary way to describe how everything on this side of eternity is mortal and is ultimately in the process of dying. And so there's a sense in which you see that throughout the entirety of the book of Ecclesiastes. I personally don't buy the there's a common reading that says that basically we get all the world of meaning at the end. I personally don't buy that as an interpretive conclusion for the book of Ecclesiastes, but that's a different issue to get into. The main point is, though, any kind of literary analysis would have to emphasize that the repeated lines in the book are the things that you're supposed to take away, right? And the repeated line over and over and over and over and over again is meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless.
That's
it's chasing after the wind and evanescing. And so there's a constant dying away, returning to the dirt of everything. You even see this in Genesis, wherein man is made of the dirt. Well, what does dirt mean in the ancient world? You can go into the story of Nergal becoming the king of the underworld. And as he goes down into the underworld, he sees people who are chewing on dirt for their food, for their nourishment, which means they're chewing on death. So it's the exact same curse that Satan was given in Genesis 3 when God throws him on his belly and he says, dirt will be your nourishment all the days of your life, which means that you're eating something that isn't actually sustaining life. Right? It's not something, it's in contrast to the food that Adam and Eve were eating, namely the fruit that would give them eternal life, effectively. Right? So now you're moving from a nourishment that's fulfilling and actually brings life to a nourishment that's ultimately just incapable of truly doing that. And so there's this sense in which dirt just overwhelmingly has this sense of mortality and that which is dying and rotting and passing away. And so the very fact that man is made of the dirt basically is to say that we are by nature mortal. And it's by this miraculous sort of intervention, this divinely given food that gives us life, that we can endure longer than that. So what happens? We get cut out of the garden, and we no longer have that food. We end up passing away. All that goes back to say, though, that this meaningless, everything is meaningless. This vaporization. Well, that fits exactly what you would expect to see if you've been kicked out of the garden that sustains you with truly nourishing and life-sustaining food into the land of Nod, the land of wandering, where no food is going to be grown. It's going to be basically you have the desert, you have dust, dirt, right, to consume. And so it fits exactly what you'd expect to see there. Nothing here is going to be lasting, eternal. And the fact of the matter is, what I'm saying sounds very, very, very nihilistic. Nietzsche himself would have said that this was nihilistic because in The Will to Power, Nietzsche actually is afraid of nihilism. And his nihilism that he's afraid of, though, isn't the nihilism we typically think of when we think of Nietzsche. The nihilism that he's afraid of is that he's afraid that the Christian is going to come in, and the Christian is going to say everything down here doesn't matter, and everything up in heaven is where all meaning and value and any of that is to be found. And so what he's going to say is, therefore, we are nihilists with regard to the lives that we are living down here. And so that's exactly the fear that Nietzsche is outlining when he's critiquing in nihilism and critiquing Christianity, saying it devalues any sense of eternal value here. And so, of course, that's his project, trying to overcome that. There's a sense in which I want to say he's right. There is a kind of nihilism that does emerge here, because it's kind of hard to see a religion built around a savior whose penultimate act was dying on a cross, right? It's kind of hard to see that as something saying, by the way, life here on this side of eternity is the ultimate goal. And so to bring that to sort of a close, or bring that point to a close, the point of the scriptures, I think I've mentioned this in past episodes, the point of the scriptures, so far as I can tell, is to prepare us for heaven, so that we're not clinging to the earthly goods that are evanescent and meaningless, everything is meaningless here, but rather that we've ordered ourselves to the eternal value, which is not actually something you can grasp in any sort of concrete way here, right? It's something that's given to you by God and sustained by him. Well, if we turn this into a book that's all about practical goods, well, practical goods are fundamentally goods rooted in this side of eternity. And so that would actually be to, in a sense, completely turn the Bible into the opposite of what it's there to teach us.
Yeah. Psychological, societal wholeness and integration is simply not enough to avoid the specter of nihilism. It makes me think of the Apostle Paul. Sometimes I feel like Peterson, what he says runs up against what Paul says, I think in 1 Corinthians. I can't remember if it's in 1 Corinthians, where he says, look, if we have hope only in this life, we are of all men to be most pitied.
Yeah.
And he said, if Christ did not rise, then let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. And that's the challenge. That's the gauntlet that Paul throws down. Either there is some transcendent personal source of meaning and value and of salvation, or there's not. It really is a black and white picture. And again, I think Peterson energetically and insistently will say that, no, there is objective meaning, value, and purpose, and we need to reject nihilism. We have to, he would say, for our very survival depends on it. So he doesn't want, don't get me wrong, he doesn't want to be a subjectivist. He doesn't want to be a relativist. And he thinks that what he's offering is an alternative. And so, but of course, our training is in philosophy. And so we just kind of look back and say, give me more. I need more.
Yeah.
I need more. If you're going to give me a true alternative to nihilism and to kind of the empty husk of relativity, we need more. We need some metaphysics there.
Let me add one more thing, though, that to try to extend a more gracious reading than what I was just giving. There is one thing on the back of the book, on the book cover by Robert Barron. There's a quote there where he notes that there's always been a polyvalence to the meaning of Scripture. That there are multiple levels of application, multiple levels of meaning that are at work in any sacred text. And he makes the point that what Peterson is really working on is the moral sense. Now, we as philosophers are going to say you don't have the moral sense without the metaphysical, right? That if you're going to say that, the good is ultimately a fullness of being, then you have to now know what being is to be able to actually say this. And we pointed this out in past episodes, wherein his definition of existence or being is not exactly one that we find metaphysically that satisfying, right? And so still, there's a ton of great wisdom, and we've said this before. There's a ton of great wisdom in
I agree with that.
Peterson's readings, precisely in the sense that I think Robert Barron is highlighting there when he's saying that this is the moral sense of the text. And so there are a whole lot of points in here that even if I think he's missing the ultimate point of Scripture, he's got such rich insights into how this is morally applicable in our lives. So it really isn't that hard to come along behind him and just import a mountain of metaphysics, basically.
Sure. Yeah, and I agree. And like I said, I think chapter 5 is a good chapter.
Yeah.
It's definitely worth reading.